Welcome, everyone. So, we're here today for the last panel of the day, or rather the last fireside chat of the day, because we've all probably heard the word news fatigue before. It has been all about it, even on the stage. We've heard that a lot of people know people that do not consume any more news, their own children or their best friends, their partners. Even journalists sat on the stage and told us about how they cannot consume news anymore. So obviously, news avoidance and news fatigue is a very important topic that we need to have a conversation about. And this last fireside chat will just focus on this topic. So on the topics on why it is a problem that we stopped trying to consume the news, or that, and why the people and why we don't make the news why people don't want to consume the news we are making. This is the way. And how can we actually get people back to consuming the news and maybe even liking consuming the news, which would be the best case scenario. So on the stage, we have Nic Newman, a senior research associate at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford University and the lead author of the Digital News Report, the world's largest ongoing survey of news consumption. He was a founding member of the BBC News website, and he's here from London. We are very happy to have him here to be part of the first ever Be Future Festival. And then Anita Zielina, founder and CEO of Better Leaders Lab, a do and think tank for good leadership and strategic management that also acts as a boutique consultancy firm. She's executive in residence at the Craig Newark Graduate School of Journalism in New York City and serves as a non-executive board member at the Austrian public broadcaster ORF, as well as the inaugural board chair of the News Product Alliance, NPA. We are also very happy to have you here. Thank you so much. So I'm very interested to hear what you have to say.
Well, thank you so much for the nice welcome. Wonderful to be here. And we thought, well, first of all, thank you for not doing panel avoidance in favor of drinks and sunshine. We are proud of you. It's 6 p.m. We'll try to make this as entertaining and interesting as we can. And we thought we'd start with a little actually user engagement here, just to keep things interesting. And we wanted to ask you guys, and just with an answer, if you can, with a simple raise of hands. Do any of you ever have a day or, a week or maybe a time when you avoid the news, when you do that yourselves? Well, that is quite a majority here, I'd say.
About 90%.
I think we do that as well, right, Nick?
We definitely do.
We definitely do. I do that as well. Do any of you, when you don't avoid the news, do you sometimes feel bad after consuming news? Yeah. Well, that is also not super surprising, but thanks for sharing that. I do feel that kind of emotion of feeling like, wow, did I just start my day with like the most depressive of news cycles here, is something that definitely resonates with me.
I actually don't start the day with news anymore.
Yeah.
So my personal news habits changed during COVID, and so we used to listen to the radio and start listening to the radio. It's been something I've done for 20, 30 years, and we just stopped and decided to have a conversation for the first hour of the day. So news sort of kicks in about 9 o'clock for me.
That's such an amazing, and I mean, one of the things about these points here is like we are obviously all power users, right? I mean, just imagine how this would look like in a room full of people who are not by their profession, somehow bound to consuming, producing, keeping up with the news, right? So I think that's one of the interesting things. Last one, I promise, and then we'll jump into some facts and figures here. But over the past few years, like 2 or 3 years, and we'll do 3 here, do you consume less, the same, or more news? let's say last 3 years. So who would say over the last 3 years less news than before? Okay, interesting, 1/3 I'd say. Who consumes about the same amount of news? Interesting, 1/3. Who consumes more? Slightly less, but that was interesting. Did you expect that?
I expected that, I
Yeah.
think, yeah, because I think it's...
Now of course you say that, Nick.
Genau.
Because
Also,
it all depends what kind of
eigentlich
news you're
richtig
talking
immer
about. So maybe we consume more of the news that we're interested in or is fun to consume, and we avoid other types of news that that is more depressing or more anxiety inducing.
So let's I think that's a good anchor to kind of bring us to some facts and figures, just for us to get on the same page about what we actually know and what science knows and what research knows about news avoidance. Can you give us like the lay of the land here a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, we've only really been looking into this since 2017 is when we started asking about it in the Digital News Report. And so we asked a question about the extent to which you sometimes or often avoid the news. And we were quite surprised then to find about a quarter on average across 46 countries said that they sometimes or often avoided the news. And then we've asked about that subsequently, and over the last few years, we've just seen that grow and grow and grow, with COVID being a real turning point, I think, as I mentioned. So in some countries, like the UK, that's doubled since 2017, so almost half the population say they sometimes or often avoid the news. In other places like Germany, it's a little bit less, maybe around 1/3, but again, we've seen increases in almost every country. And I think it's hard to know exactly what's going on and why that is, but I think it's partly the sort of relentless nature and the negative nature of things that are happening in the world, and COVID obviously one, but then climate change, the war in Ukraine, the cost of living crisis, sort of one after another, and it all just sort of seems too much, so people are diverting. I think another thing that's happening, which doesn't get talked about a lot, is I think the decline of television news. So again, partly because of COVID, people really sort of did the binge watching via streaming services, and of course there's no sort of hammocking into traditional news, and that was a way in which a lot of people got their news daily in a very sort of easy way. They would just be sitting on the sofa and getting the news, and I think this is one of the reasons we're seeing increases in sort of people who say they're consuming no news at all, because those people aren't watching the television news anymore, and they don't feel engaged enough to go onto online digital media either. So we've got that sort of disconnection problem, and then you've got the problem in the room, which is that we've just got so much news, we feel overloaded with it. So it's this sort of dual problem in a way.
So where would you see, if, from you knowing that landscape so well and the research so well, are most of these people we are talking about when we talk about news avoiders people who completely zone out? They're basically like, this is not for me, and I'm just not keeping up with it, and I'm just gonna stream Hulu and Netflix, and that's enough for me? Or is it more kind of this like tension of, I have a day where I just can't take it anymore? What do you see like as the strongest trend?
Yeah, it's both. I think the people who are avoiding it completely is a smaller proportion, and as I say, some of that is to do with the changing nature of television and I think just the availability of entertainment and other options. Basically, there's always something more interesting to do. And then there's a group, and we talked to a number of them this year. Some people call these news outsiders, so often younger, less educated. And we talked to some of them, and we heard some amazing stories, like they would be listening to the radio, to music radio, and they knew the news was going to come on, and they actually switched over to another channel and then switched back again afterwards, or they'd be scrolling through their social media feeds, and they would see a news story and just scroll straight past it. So that's sort of linked to low interest. And then there's the second group who are just sort of overwhelmed. Maybe things like they would be turning off their mobile notifications, or doing the sort of thing I'm doing, which is, not listening to news first thing in the morning or last thing at night, or just avoiding particular types of stories. So I was reading about people who are avoiding specifically politics and news about Donald Trump because they feel that it doesn't get you anywhere. It's like this endless nightmare that just goes on in a loop and never gets resolved. So that sense of helplessness, have you ever felt that? Yeah.
Well, absolutely. So having spent the Trump years in New York, waking up at 5 in the morning and being like, what did he tweet this morning was not a pleasant feeling to wake up to.
Right.
I mean, I think that resonated with many people. So that might have changed something.
But in 2016, that was like everywhere, and it was new, and it was what people were doing, and I think people have just got really tired of that kind of politics. Yeah.
Is it a bad thing that people get tired of news? I mean, is it like, sometimes I feel when we talk about news avoidance, we almost have this like, oh, you know, they're just not, they need to kind of be interested in news again. They should. It's good for them, right?
Right.
It's like the healthy, they're eating their granola. It's not like the chocolate bar.
There's definitely a question about, you know, is there a right amount? And I think partly because of the incentives, what the news industry is doing, the solutions to everything is producing more media. You know, more newsletters, more podcasts, and right now we're seeing all of that in that space because the incentives around advertising or whatever it is to produce more volume. But that's another case where there's a mismatch actually between what people are really asking for. If you listen, most people are not looking for more media, they're looking for more relevant media, they're looking for media that makes them smarter. More distinctive media, but a lot of this is really coming out of the incentives, and obviously we saw that during clickbait and because the business model was driven by advertising, but we're also seeing it again, I think, with this new wave of sort of social video and podcasts and newsletters. People think the answer is more media, and it isn't.
Do you think that was kind of a wave that we almost created ourselves when, with this, like, you know, the last, before this kind of cycle back happened in the last 5 years, the 10 years before were all about abundance, and you can get all your news everywhere all at once in seconds, and everything was about being fast and push messages and, you know, like being everywhere all at once. Is that just too much for the human brain to like to handle?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of equate it to going into big supermarkets when supermarkets got huge, and I would just walk around the aisles looking for. I couldn't find what I was looking for, and I'd walk out of the shop and go to a smaller shop. So I think it's very similar. We just feel completely overwhelmed, and we think that there's abundant media now, but I mean, what's it going to be like in 5 years' time with artificial intelligence and, you know, creating even more synthetic media? Because again, the incentives are going to be to get into that algorithm to produce more stuff, and I think that's the challenge. I mean, I do think that, you know, the focus on reader revenue and building relationships is a counter trend to that, and so there are positive trends as well as the sort of AI trend that might push in a different direction.
And I almost feel like on the product side, the trend towards newsletters and kind of confined products that are kind of confined spaces that give you all you need to know in 5 minutes is almost also an anti-trend to that everything everywhere all at once thing, right?
Right, and I think again, a lot of this comes back to things like metrics, doesn't it? You know, if the metrics were to maximize the amount of time in an algorithm or on a website through trying to get people to click on something they didn't want to click on, we have seen a counter trend to that. I mean, things like Axios, for example, trying to be respectful of people's time. We did a piece of research with young people in 2019, and we came up with this user needs model, which has been superseded by other user needs models, but it was called Moments. And I think what it identified was that people have different requirements around news. So one of them is just to be updated really quickly, and some of that came out of digital and mobile. And that's what Axios does really well. So you create products and newsletters and morning newsletters to help you get as much information as you can really, really quickly. And then there's another mode which is more about, I want to luxuriate and I really want to learn something and I want to go into depth with something. So we saw young people doing that weekends, for example, setting aside time or listening to a podcast and really learning about something. And so I think more sophisticated media companies are now thinking about how to generate products for these different use cases. And of course, Divert Me being another one, that you just want something really quick and throwaway or a headline or something that's going to make you laugh.
Yeah, that's a super interesting approach. We've been talking now about news avoidance, and another word that often kind of, is used in the same conversation is news fatigue. are those the same? Are they different? Are they related?
I think they're related, but a little bit different. I mean, when we asked about, why you avoid the news, the top reason was really about news fatigue. It was too much. This was a couple of years ago. It was about too much COVID, and it was at a point where the story didn't seem to be moving forwards very much, and it sort of seemed endless. And it was about the amount of coverage on the news, actually. It would be 20, 30 minutes on the news, and it was squeezing out diversity. So it was that sense that these big stories, particularly sort of television news, and then the same with Ukraine as well. I think we've seen with big stories, what we've seen is people, and this is also comes out of the data, looking at people's data, is that people come in still for the big stories, but then they disappear much more quickly than they used to. And that was definitely the case with the invasion of Ukraine. So we were doing some user research with young people, and they didn't know much about Ukraine, and then Ukraine got invaded, and we saw young people turning on the television and really engaging really deeply. But then it was only about 5 minutes, and then they disappeared again. And around politics, I think we're seeing news fatigue around politics in the US. Even now, the beginning of a news cycle, as you know, we've seen something like 10% off for the cable networks in the first quarter. You've seen some of the big news organizations like New York Times, Washington Post down 20%, 30% in the last year, when you would expect that to be kind of picking up. And I think that's so a lot of the news fatigue is with these relentless, the way politics is covered, I think.
So you'd say those kind of recent losses in reach, in engagement are probably more related to news fatigue than a sudden kind of, extreme rise in news avoidance in general. It's more like these big news cycles where we just at some point feel like this is just getting, this is getting too much.
Yeah, I mean, they're obviously related, but I think, and I suppose what we don't know is, news has always been cyclical, and we've seen that. You have moments in history. I mean, I started my journalistic career before the Berlin Wall came down, and news was really quiet for a long time. We were really scratching around to find any news and cover any news, and then it just all happened in 1989, to 1992. So you had this massive upsurge in interest. Tiananmen Square, I think Lech Wałęsa, all on the same day. The Shah being overthrown, all on the same day. June, whatever it was. So some of this may well be cyclical, and again, you have these moments when things change, like Brexit and Donald Trump being elected, when everything's turning on its axis and interest in news is really intense. So it's hard to separate out cyclical events, which we've always had, from some of these other phenomena.
I recently talked to a friend of mine who's still working in political journalism. There's this amazing German word called Sommerloch.
It's a great word.
Which basically just means summer hole. And when I started in political journalism, there was this thing about, what do we do? I mean, there's nothing going on. It's the summer. We just have to come up with stories, with, weird stories about politicians doing something that are not actually interesting. And this friend of mine said, "Oh my God, how I wish we had that back." Now I miss it. I mean, it was hard to kind of work with it, but now I kind of miss it. So I think you're making a good point here that it's probably not just us, and it's probably not just the news. It's probably like humanity being tired of the pace of
change.
Right?
Pace of change is a huge thing, I think. Yeah.
And that might eventually slow down a bit, or at least we might perceive a slowdown, right? Well, hopefully. Well,
we hope. Things can't carry on at this intensity, right?
No more crisis, please. Let's talk a little bit, since this is a constructive journalism conference, and we wanted to have the lay of land here and a little bit of the facts and figures, but we also want to talk about what we can do, what journalism can do to actually work against news avoidance and work against news fatigue. So let's spend some time on that. How could we help as journalists, as media organizations? How could we help turn this around? What are some tactics, some strategies that you see working?
Well, we were interested in what might interest people who were saying they were avoiding the news. So what kind of news would they be more interested in? What they told us, and of course what they say in surveys is not always what they do, but they told us that they would like more positive news. They told us they would like, it almost sounds like this comes from, constructive journalism, isn't it? They would prefer news that didn't just point out problems but also offered solutions. They liked explanatory journalism, news that helped them understand the world, and that they were least interested in the sort of twists and turns of the big stories of the day. So kind of some of the reasons that we talked about. But I thought what was really interesting was that people who said they never avoided the news said they were most interested in those big stories. So this is really the challenge, I think, for media organizations, because a lot of the money and the interest and the clicks and the reach and the metrics comes from those super users who are coming every day and using it very heavily. So so the challenge is, how do you create products that are not one size fits all? So I mean, I think one answer is to create more differentiated products and better ways of satisfying super users who really want the depth, and then other people who want a better balance.
Yeah.
And that's really difficult. I mean, part of the answer is product and personalization, something we have been talking about for literally 20 years and hasn't really worked when it comes to journalism.
But I think you're making such a good point when you tie it to the business perspective, and obviously the business perspective being a hugely important one for many media organizations, all media organizations these days. I think with the shift towards subscriptions, we've been starting to optimize so much towards that permanent engagement and those super users, and now suddenly we're like, oh no, those are actually the people who are moving into a direction that we don't want them to move. So basically media organizations have to almost make a little bit of a decision, short-term revenue versus kind of long-term health of the ecosystem, right?
Yeah, and I think it's also about how the ecosystem works in different countries. So, this sort of balance between commercial media who are subscription-based, more popular media that have a duty to reach everyone or trying to reach everyone, perhaps with ad models, and public service media. And we have much more of that, I think, in parts of Europe. There is a better balance between those things, and different media companies now trying to do different things. So, it is very hard for, I talk to a lot of subscription publishers, and they don't really, part of the issue is, how do you reach out to people who are less interested in the news? So that means going out into social channels, using new formats like TikTok and more engaging media. But subscription publishers have no interest in doing that because there's no money in it. So, but of course, public media does, because it has to build reach and reputation with all those different groups.
Have you seen interesting examples of public service media and public media, like, dabbling into that like news avoidance topic and trying to deal, work with constructive journalism, work with products or services that actually deal with these issues? I mean,
totally. And to be fair, not just public media organizations, but yes, I mean, solutions journalism, more positive journalism, there's a lot of talk about that, but actually quite a lot of action as well. So yeah, around climate, so stories, inspirational stories, podcasts that talk about solutions. There was a great one on the BBC recently, 39 Ways to Save the Planet. Each one a perfectly formed, really interesting story, inspirational stories, people fixing the world, which did really well on YouTube and really engaged lots of people and brought a real diversity, I think, of stories. So often people think, well, what you're doing is you're replacing journalism's job to hold rich and powerful people to account and ask difficult questions with this sort of fluffy, positive concept. And there is a lot of resistance to that in newsrooms, but it's more of a blend. It's more, how do you get the balance? Because if you're going through social media feeds and it's just one bad thing after another, where's the balance? It's not sort of curated in the way that a newspaper was curated. So we have to find other ways of doing it.
I feel part of that resistance, well, on one hand, there's always, journalists are good at resisting transformation, right? And we all know that. And they're always also there's skepticism against concepts. So like there is this framework now, and everyone's like, framework, yeah. It's not like, it's not like newsrooms kind of, have that excited wave of like,
No.
joy when
It's
you
like
tell them that you're going to work on a framework.
It's like a
or
consultant has mentioned that,
strategic
right?
concept or something. It usually doesn't go down that well. But part of it, I think, might be self-inflicted a little bit when I think about those first, when basically constructive journalism was getting started. It was framed more as let's talk about good news instead of bad news, rather than let's talk about a constructive angle to the bad things that are happening in the world. And that I feel, that I personally also felt like a little bit like, well, come on, guys, we can't look at the world. We can't just talk about, happy, fluffy puppies here, right? I mean, there are other things to care about. But I feel almost like the constructive journalism debate as it relates to news avoidance has matured a little bit into, just kind of figuring out how to find that right balance.
Yeah, I think so, but I think there is still a lot of resistance. If you go into newsrooms, people say, well, news is just difficult. That's how it is, and we are hardwired, and the audiences actually don't mean what they say. They actually look at our figures. They are hitting on the negative stories, and this researchers have done a lot of work on this and show that this is true, that we are drawn to negative things. It's the survival instinct, this negativity bias. There's a lot of research around that. On the other hand, some of that research is really interesting because it shows that we're not all the same, that yes, we are drawn to negative stories, or many of us are, but actually there's much more appetite for positive and inspirational stories as well. And I think you can see that in what people do. If you go onto TikTok, for example, there are some fantastic examples of inspirational stories, positive news. There's a great one Alina Wood does, which is TikToks about the environment, and she just kind of reads out 4 or 5 positive stories, which are always interesting. Yeah. And it's not like replacing the other stuff. It's just like it's something you can have alongside it. And if you read the comments from young people, they say, "You've saved my life. You're restoring my faith in information."
Absolutely.
So it's a balance.
I'm always so sad when I hear publishers kind of diminish TikTok as like, "Oh, this is the entertainment space," and I'm like, look at how journalism and how education is being done in that space, and how constructive,
or whatever,
or
the stuff on AI. Yeah.
Nic, by the way, has written an amazing research report about TikTok and the news that I can only recommend. That has a few, I think, great examples.
Lots of great examples.
Lots of great examples how news and how journalism can basically exist on TikTok. But I think that's a fantastic kind of analogy to think about. Not how can we be more like TikTok necessarily in a storytelling way, but how can we tackle problems a little bit more like some TikTok creators in a constructive and solutions-oriented way.
And I think the other point is entertainment. So it's really, I think, one of the things which again is difficult for journalism is how do you combine difficult news stories and entertaining formats. And TikTok can do, TikTok at its best does that really well. But I think there are other formats such as podcasting, for example. So some of the most successful podcasts, particularly what we call extended chat podcasts, are these sort of longer form podcasts where people are really engaging with some personalities around serious political issues, for example, for 45 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, are sort of a combination of serious stuff and entertainment in an entertainment wrapper, essentially. And I think that is, again, one of the antidotes to news avoidance is how can we just make the news more accessible in different ways? It might be a TikTok, it might be an entertaining podcast, rather than what we thought digital was about was just writing 800-word stories, but it's very dry. It doesn't engage or entertain in the way that television news often did.
So formats
is critical.
Products. What about tone?
Tone is, tone is the other one. Particularly the work we've done on younger people suggests that tone is really important. And tone, of course, also relates to diversity of voices and who is presenting the news as well. So that sort of relevance and the fact that you're going to take a story seriously depends on the person who's telling it and the tone and that they're talking a language like you. Yeah. And somehow that sort of person behind a newsreader's, on a television news bulletin just feels stuffy and wrong to many people now.
And one thing that we do know from the Reuters digital news report is that more and more, specifically young generations, trust people rather than brands, right? Rather than news brands. So like that personalization, not in the AI and tech way personalization, but that personalization of brands also seems to have some, some element.
That's about the tone, I think. And but it's also challenging, isn't it? You know, because does it detract from the impartiality and the accuracy? If you go down too far down that route, does it push you further into opinion, which is again what audiences say, many audiences say they don't want. So I think this is genuinely challenging, actually. How do you take a product that we've been doing in a particular way for a long time, and how do you make it truly engaging without dumbing it down?
Absolutely, and I think it's another area where newsrooms are very sensitive, like the objectivity, personalization, opinion debate. How much do we actually want to be out there? Do we want our presenters, do we want our journalists to be on TikTok and have an opinion and explain things? So I personally feel that this is one of like the most fragile and trickiest areas of resistance at the moment.
Yeah, and I think this may also be supercharged by AI in terms of, you can take personalities and you can create more of those personalities digitally and avatars and bots. You can have 24-hour personalities, and I think we're going to see that news organizations try to close this gap of expectation around personalities by trying to make more of those personalities in lots and lots of different ways.
That does not sound like a very optimistic angle on how
Well,
AI might influence news avoidance, but is AI gonna actually accelerate that problem that we have here, or do you also see a potential to use AI, as a means to work against news avoidance?
Yeah, all of those things. I mean, I don't know how it's going to work out, but I mean, there are clearly. So I think we've got a problem of relevance of format and the types of formats. So currently we've got this one-size-fits-all product, and AI offers the hope that you can create more formats automatically or semi-automatically much easier, and then that you could show, for example, it has this amazing ability to transform content. So you can take an article that's written for somebody who really knows a lot about a subject, you can turn it into something that works for a 12-year-old, and you can immediately create a product for younger people, or you can just show it to people if they if they prefer it that way, or they prefer bullet points rather than narrative articles. So we're going to see a lot of that, I think, transforming text stories into visual stories. We already can take a text story and transfer it into an audio version in different languages. So this is about relevance. Hopefully it addresses the relevance problem around news avoidance. But then there's the other problem is around what AI is going to do to trust, and the explosion of synthetic content, and whether that will just turn people off even more, because they'll just say, you can't trust anything anymore, you can't tell the difference between what's true and what's false. So I don't know. It could go anyway. It could go anyway.
Oh my God! I wish you had the
could be better, could be worse.
The optimistic kind of solution to that issue. Now I was kind of expecting that. We'll open it up for questions from the audience. We have some time for questions. We hope you have questions. I think our colleagues here have mics that they can share. So if you just want to raise your hand if you have any questions, and we'll get that mic to you. We have a question back here. And if you want to also say who you are and where you're from, that would be fantastic.
Hi, Aparna Mukherjee, Chief Programs Officer at Resolve Philly. We were on that stage earlier today. Derek Kane, and the Director of Community Engagement from Resolve, and I were talking about what I would describe as not just building trust in underrepresented communities, but building trust overall. Obviously, that is kind of at the core of everything we're talking about. And I'm wondering, because so often we talk about youth engagement strategies, that one of the pieces of building trust from my brief experience at Resolve, but in legacy media, is that intergenerational trust is a big part of this. And I'm curious how much of that is a lens into your work, and how much that chasing youth part that is so implicit in the future of journalism, how much what's come before in that interplay is a piece of what
So
you do.
interesting, Aparna. Thanks for that question. Nic, any thoughts? Intergenerational trust.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's not one I've thought about a lot, but I think there's a lot. There is, there's a real focus on we have to chase those younger audiences, and it's much broader than that. I mean, certainly when we look at news avoidance and a number of other indicators, actually, we don't find that there's a particular trust problem with young people. It goes across all age groups. It goes across gender, goes across educational background. And, again, I think some of this comes back to the pace of change, doesn't it? And the way in which, life events like COVID have really pushed us apart generationally as well. So some of the ways in which people came into news, through our research, we see brand loyalty for something is something that was sort of handed down from generation to generation. So that they got to know a particular brand, and when they grew into news, then they sort of took on that mantle. But what we see with the 18 to 24s in particular is that breaking down. So because they've been socialized by social media, they're not really they don't really have that connection with news, that sort of regularity, and so I think that could be the start of a further breakdown, or it may not be, but I think we certainly need more research into that.
Yeah, super interesting. And I feel like one of the things that is happening is that definitely younger generations are the ones in newsrooms that are pushing more for that, redefinition of objectivity and redefinition of opinions, and want to become more opinionated, driven by the creator economy.
Yes, it's a huge tension in many newsrooms, and putting pressure on how you interpret impartiality. I think that's been tricky. There's in terms of sort of getting more personality into it, I think or more informality of tone. I think that's less of a problem than actually taking younger people, young journalists, feeling that news organizations should take a view on divisive issues where older people think you should just lay out the facts and let people decide. So I think there's a difference between the tone, where I think you can move interpretations of impartiality, and the actual, the sort of core.
Yeah, really good point. Further questions?
I'm Gianni from Argentina. Most of us would agree that this constructive approach can be a solution for the news avoidance. But you mentioned, Anita, that we journalists, we are not easy to change.
So that's just my experience. Maybe I'm wrong.
No,
but
that's everybody's experience. So I have a simple question. How do you change the mindset of an industry?
A very simple question, right? Nic, do you want to start? That should be simple.
I think this is
that should be easy.
This is a great question for the Better Leaders Lab, right? I think you change in lots of different ways in an organization. So part of it is by doing and by sort of innovating. A very effective way of changing, I think, is bringing disruptors into a newsroom, whether that's younger people or just people who think differently. And of course, the other key thing is leadership. I mean, seriously, leaders who can point to a vision that is different and explain the why at the same time. And I was very fortunate to work at the BBC when Mark Thompson was there at a time of a huge change. And what he managed to do was sort of be across the detail, but also clarify that longer term vision, but the why this was going to be important, the sort of the burning platform, and not necessarily today, but why people need to come along with it. And so it's a complicated mixture of leadership and individual tactical things.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And the only thing that I'd add is it's long-term, consistent work and communication. What I see is that often these efforts just, after 2 years, it's like, oh, it didn't work, we'll bring in someone new. I mean, how can a large-scale mindset shift work in a year or two, right?
Right. Another just example is by when somebody is doing stuff that is brilliant, and I'm thinking of somebody like Emily Casriels at the BBC, who did a lot of stuff around constructive journalism and deep listening. She's doing a lot of thinking about that. That some of her bosses deliberately elevated that and talked about it around the organization and amplified it. And I think that's the other part of leadership. You know, you don't necessarily know how to change things, but when you see something good, you try and really help that move forward.
Yeah, really smart answer, yeah. Yes.
Hello,
next
I'm
question.
Jonathan Marks. I'm a media analyst based in the Netherlands. I know Nick from past life in broadcasting.
This sounds worrying, isn't it? I'm really worried
We
about
like
the next
to hear
question.
stories about
This is
Nick's
literally
childhood.
somebody who knew me decades ago.
The question
to
is,
hear.
I'm curious about whether, because you mentioned the Reuters survey is in many countries. What about Asia? What about societies where, in Japan, it's heading towards the audience is either dead or deaf. So, are you seeing media avoidance in those sort of countries?
We are.
And also in countries that are fragile states?
Interestingly, less so in some of the fragile states. So in a lot of the African countries, we see some of the lowest levels of news avoidance. And I think that's just because politics kind of matters still in a different way. But in Japan, we see massive indifference about news, and actually one of the highest rates of news outsiders or people who say they consume no news, something like 15% in Japan. That's gone from 3% to 15%, so very similar to US levels. And we're still sort of trying to dig into a little bit why that is.
Same in Korea?
I mean, news avoidance has grown in almost every country that we've looked at since 2017, including many of those Asian countries. So yes, this is genuinely, I think we can say, a global phenomenon. It's at different rates, but I think a lot of the same issues around abundance, the fact that the so much choice, that the media is not reflecting what people want, so that expectations gap, I think that's happening everywhere in the world.
Just because we are in these international kind of conversations here, where does Germany rank?
Germany is always a little bit behind in terms of, but I mean that in a good way.
This is the headline for tomorrow.
I do mean that in a good way. I hope people aren't going to take that out of context. What I mean is it's the fundamental changes are the same, but it just happens a bit slower.
Okay. So Germany still has a bit more time to figure things out.
Exactly, which is good, which is positive. I realized that was not very well expressed.
It's only a room full of journalists, so
I
I'm
know.
going to make that the headline
I
of
said
what
that
you
to
said
a load
here.
of people from
No
Germany.
worries,
Yeah,
Nick.
sorry.
We're going to hear about your teenager stories afterwards,
Yeah.
and we're going to just use that as a headline. It's all good. Further questions? Back here, please.
Hi, Claudia Rittl from Bonn Institute. To Mr. Nickman, one short question. You have mentioned the BBC user needs model in your speech. What do you think? How can the user needs model help to address news avoidance and news fatigue? I would like to hear your opinion on this. And let's say, for example, for a local or regional paper.
I think the BBC's user needs model won't necessarily work for everybody, and many people are adapting it. But I think what's interesting is more and more media companies are looking at the content they're producing and trying to close this expectations gap. And the user needs model is one way of doing that. So you essentially look at the stories that you do, and quite often these are now tagged in content management systems. So people are starting, as they commission stories, to tag the story as an updating story, an update me story, or an educate me story, or an inspire me story, or a divert me story. So these sort of core user needs. And then that allows you to look at where people are showing interest and where certain types of users are showing interest and whether you're over-indexing or over-commissioning certain types of news. I think the problem with that is it comes up against this point about what journalism should be doing, holding people to account, investigating, so we're not always trying to just optimize for what users want. We also have a view about what we're trying to do as an organization. I think that's why we need to use it intelligently. But I think what it is doing is putting more focus on some of the constructive concepts, like inspiring you or educating you. And I think certainly from the conversations we've had with younger people in particular, this really chimes with what it is they want. So I think those aspects can work really well as part of a strategy.
But again, most likely not everyone in the newsroom is going to be psyched about the fact that there is now a model they should
lots of
use
resistance. There's been huge amounts of resistance in organizations, and I've been involved in a number of organizations where they've introduced user needs models. And yeah, people think it's, the consultants coming in with their metrics again, which is partly true.
Further questions? We have time for 2 more, I'd say. One here in the middle.
My question is about, I think you mentioned that news avoidance was happening across different segments of ages, gender, and I was wondering what role those class and socioeconomic backgrounds have in news avoidance dynamics. Thank you very much.
Sorry, just slightly missed the last bit.
What backgrounds? Did you say?
Like what role does class, socioeconomic class and socioeconomic backgrounds have in news avoidance?
So I talked earlier about 2 different types. So I think people who are avoiding news completely, or say they're avoiding news completely, and they tend to be lower levels of education, lower social class, and they also, as I mentioned earlier, I think they overlap a lot with people who watch television. So that's the thing I'm most worried about, because we're seeing sort of the decline in traditional linear television by about sort of 5 to 10% in most countries year on year. Television news, I don't mean television and drama. People are still watching those things. So I think that segment we're really watching closely, because I think it affects democratic engagement, essentially, across different groups. Digital just isn't really providing that. I think we don't really see so much difference in the other kind of avoidance, selective avoidance. That seems to be more about age or gender rather than social class. Yeah.
Last question, anyone here in the middle?
Thank you. I'm Stefan from Smart Octo. The amount of traffic on news sites coming via social media is declining a lot. Yeah. Media outlets need to redefine the way they find new audiences. A constructive question: how could the search for different ways to find new audiences be a chance for journalism to overcome news avoidance?
That's a great question to finish with. I think that I think many media companies are heading for a crisis. Many of them already hit a crisis because of the decline in social and potentially the decline in traffic from search, which is coming through artificial intelligence. So my experience is whenever you have a big change like that, a lot of good things come out of it, and in many cases a lot of bad companies go under, because all of that search clickbait, for example. There's going to be no point in doing it in the future so we're going to have to think of different ways. So the positive answer is that it will force us to be more creative. It will force us to create different content on other platforms and to experiment more. And I think we're seeing that with TikTok and YouTube and other areas which are in growth. We're seeing it with the focus on direct connection and building of relationships and community, which I think is going to be a big part of the future of the next 5 years. And I'm actually pretty optimistic. I actually think we need this change to make journalism to be better. Whoa!
An optimistic final call. What a perfect way to end the day with some. Thank you for the constructive questions, and specifically the last hyper-constructive question. Thank you, Nic, for being here and for that wonderful conversation. And thanks everyone for choosing us over the drinks. But now have the drinks. Thanks everyone.